Tipping point, oh tipping point. Tipping point gonna flip on you. Tipping point, oh tipping point. Tipping point gonna flip on me too. Tipping point, oh tipping point. 16 points all ready to flip. Tipping point, oh tipping point. A big one flipped, we're all in the poo. G'day YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. We've just passed a really big one. Those of you who are familiar with my channel may recall that when I was born 64 years ago, there was 319 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of the Earth. Those of you who've listened to me or done your own scholarship will be aware that for about 12 million years, an atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration between 150 and 280 millibars, parts per million rather, was the operating range, and in 1775 it was 275. We were 5 parts per million below the all-time high point. And then we had the Industrial Revolution, the steam-powered Industrial Revolution, and we've been burning coal ever since. And then we started burning oil. We'd been burning natural gas for 1,000 years or so before that, particularly in China. And we'd been releasing fossil carbon to the atmosphere. And in the 1850s, carbon dioxide was discovered to be a greenhouse gas, and by the 1880s, the best chemists in Europe had come up with the realisation that if we kept on burning coal, we were going to warm the planet. And I'm pretty sure they'd found evidence of that fact by about 1900. 1912 was the first time a tabloid newspaper article was printed talking about combustion of fossil carbon and atmospheric carbon emissions and changes to the global climate. 1912, Popular Mechanics of America. So we've known about this for a long time. Year I was born, 1961, maybe the year before, President Eisenhower established the NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, for the US government to be advised by the best, brightest minds in the field about the likely consequences of continued burning of fossil carbon. POTUS 4547, among other things, has acted to greatly reduce the funding of NOAA. Some of the other things he's done has been to cut off the weather forecasters' access to the satellites which tell them the sea surface temperatures. So it's going to be a lot harder for the Americans to forecast any likely hurricanes, tornadoes, massive torrential downpours, flash floods, stuff like that, because they've got less access to the scientific tools, which are there. But you see, somebody somewhere in the White House has come up with a rationale that it's a cybersecurity threat to America's national security if the weather forecasters are allowed access to the satellites which were put there to measure sea surface temperatures and ground surface temperatures. Basically, the current American administration appears to be operating on the hypothesis that if they get rid of all of the people doing the research, then there will be no data, and without the data there can be no proof, and without any proof then there is no problem. Which is how come 94 people are supposed to, no, they went over 100 this morning. Over 100 people got swept away by a flash flood in Texas, where they'd built a bloody holiday camp on the flood shelf beside a river in hill country, where it's renowned for flash floods. And whereas once upon a time, last time that river had a catastrophic flood, all the towns had sirens on towers to warn people to get up and move uphill. Now they have mobile phones. So the mobile phones in the area were sent a text message at 1 o'clock in the morning. Beware, there's going to be a big storm and extreme likelihood of intense flash floods. And 30 minutes later, a place called the Mystic Camp for Christian Girls, a bunch of 20, 21-year-olds got swept away with their entire campsite. 30 minutes after the first warning went out. But apparently there's 30% less weather forecasters than there used to be in the USA, and they put up 20% less weather balloons. So the 30% less weather forecasters have got 20% less data on the atmospheric winds. But 12 hours, 18 hours before the rainstorm that caused the flash flood, an astronaut on the space station took a photograph of what they call a sprite. When there's a really big lightning strike on the ground, an equally big spike of electricity fires up out of the top of the cloud, and those things are called sprites, and you can photograph them from space. And a really huge sprite came out of a cloud that was 50,000 feet high, and that was the cloud that manoeuvred over and rained on Kellyville and the Guadalupe River foothills and flooded the Mystic holiday camp. Okay, so what's this got to do with the tipping point? Well, you might have noticed that I'm standing in a half-dead dry sclerophyll forest. When I was a little kid, this was a wet sclerophyll forest. And it was trap rock country, and it was really sort of cheap because you get bogged every winter for months at a time. And when I bought it, it was a sclerophyll forest 35 years ago. It had dried out somewhat. In 2018, it had become a dry sclerophyll forest, and then we got hit with the extreme heatwave mega firestorm drought that went on till 2019, 2020. And about half of the trees in the canopy died. That's why there's so many dead sticks up there, and that's why there's so many dead sticks down here. Something obviously big had changed. Well, it turns out, thanks to Paul Beckwith, I know about this because he put up a video yesterday titled Abrupt Antarctic Ocean Regime Shift, Reversed SMOC, Southern Meridional Overturning Circulation. If you want the actual proper explanation, go and watch Paul explain it for you. However, if you'd like to have the hillbilly explanation, the layman's understanding of what's going on, we'll start with what most people have heard of, which is the Atlantic Conveyor Current, or the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current. And that basically takes the warm water from the Gulf of Mexico, which Trump wants to call the Gulf of America, and it runs it up along the American west coast and keeps their ports, you know, free of ice. New York doesn't get frozen, then crosses the Atlantic, and it means that the British Isles and Europe, their ports don't get iced in either. And then it sort of cools down and falls down to the bottom of the ocean and runs back down, and it's been recently interrupted by a flood of cold fresh water falling off Greenland as the Greenland ice caps melt. And for at least 5 years, 10 years, there's been a steady stream of scientific papers, peer-reviewed, published in scientific journals, people being disquieted by the changes to the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current. And there have been a lot of people spending a lot of time worrying about what might happen if it stops. And the worst of the doomsday merchants have been saying, well, what if it doesn't stop but it reverses? Now, how much chaos could that bring to trade and shipping and commerce and economics and politics in the Northern Hemisphere? Well, there's an equivalent in the Southern Hemisphere, and there's a current that runs around Antarctica. Looked at from above the South Pole, it runs clockwise. Clockwise to me, clockwise to you. For about 30, 35 years, there's been a lot of people taking some comfort from the fact that even though global temperatures were warming, Antarctica seemed to be maintaining a reserve of compensating feedback mechanisms whereby as ice melted on the landmass, the runoff was fresh water, and the fresh water got onto the Antarctic Ocean, and it was cold and it was fresh, so it was very easy for that fresh water to freeze and become sea ice. And very, very, very gradually, over 35 years, the Antarctic sea ice was actually growing while the Arctic sea ice has been shrinking every year to the point where pretty soon they're going to have a blue ocean event completely. But that wasn't happening in the southern hemisphere. And I like to look at it as a feedback mechanism, like the black and white snow daisies of Siberia, which, if it gets too hot, the black snow daisies all die off and only the ones in the shade survive. And the white snow daisies are so numerous that on the vast steppes of Siberia, they succeed in changing the albedo of the planet enough to cope with a plus or minus 5% difference in solar radiation. It's a feedback mechanism that sent Lovelock onto his Gaia hypothesis. Anyway, that's what was going on. Antarctica as a continent was attempting to increase its own albedo despite the warm air melting the ice by growing a bigger sea ice pack around it. More white ice, shinier, reflects more heat back to space. That was great. Well, and they've got satellite data to prove this, because they've got microwave satellites that can tell you the salinity of the surface of the ocean, just like it can tell you the temperature. The ocean, we've known for 100 years, has been acting as a sponge, soaking up heat from the atmosphere and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's all been percolating down. And something has changed in a big way, because up until 2014, all of the water in the top couple of 100 metres of the Antarctic Ocean, it was fresh. It was a layer of fresh water. That stopped in 2015, and by 2016, all of that water was salt water, heavily salted water, and it was warm. So what's happening at the moment is that warm, salty water all the way around the continent of Antarctica, on the outside of the ice sheet and under the ice sheet, all of that water, it's no longer cold fresh water. It's now warm salty water. And that happened 2014, 2015. 2018, the extreme heat wave, mega firestorm drought kicked in here. And in 2015, here in this forest, I did my biggest ever burn program, 36 burns in 3 months, me on my own, nobody to help me, and I blacked out 8 acres. When I came back from having my head cooked in the linear accelerator, which is why I have such a marvellous asymmetric beard, I did a burn program, and in the same 3-month window, I only lit 19 fires instead of 36, because the days when it was safe to light a fire, there was less of them, about half the number of days. And I didn't do 8.8 acres. I did 3,700 square metres. I didn't make 1 acre. An acre's 4,000 square metres. So if you measure fire behaviour and fire intensity by how much one person who knows what they're doing can burn in a season, as limited by the intensity of the fire behaviour, I'd have to say fire behaviour in that 8 years, it became 600% more intense and more scary. The last little fire I did, that was only a couple of, I think 267 square metres or something. It only took 20 minutes to do. But as I was turning the bottom corner on it with dry, head-high grass and tea tree behind me, off a 1 metre hand line with a little wet line I'd laid with a water can, I melted the lens on my hand torch that was hanging on the front of my personal protective equipment overall, because I had a chest camera and I had a torch hanging on the beside the chest camera, and I had a leaf blower and I had a drip torch, and I'm trying to edge my way from my right to my left, turn the corner, light the stuff up and not get cooked. And every year it gets scarier and scarier, and I don't know why we've been lucky enough here that we've had a run of moist, wet years, so a lot of the dry, dead sticks are falling on the ground and rotting and becoming topsoil, and I'm hoping the topsoil will hold more moisture for longer, so next time we get a drought, once again, this will be the greenest little patch, and when a fire comes, it'll go around this little green patch because there's too much moisture content in the soil and the vegetation for it to take off. But I'm probably having myself on, because according to Paul Beckwith, as this salty, carbon dioxide rich water from the ocean floor is welling up around Antarctica, not only is it melting the sea ice, warming the last reserve of coldness on the planet, so to speak, it's dumping carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So what used to be a sponge, a sink for carbon dioxide, it's now pumping it out. So in my lifetime, we've gone from 319 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air to now 424 parts per million. We've increased the amount of greenhouse gas by 33%. 100 is a fraction of 300, it's a third. We're now at 400, where we used to be at 300, or 424, we used to be 319. What Beckwith said, and he establishes that in the lecture or the presentation, the YouTube video I've directed you to. What he says in there is that he's gone and looked at other papers related to the first one to see what the implications are. And apparently, as a result of the reversal of the smog, we can expect greenhouse gas levels to have doubled by the end of this century. So by 2100, we're looking at somewhere north of 800 parts per million, because the ocean is now pumping greenhouse gas back at us. Tipping point, oh tipping point, tipping point gonna flip on you. Tipping point, oh tipping point, tipping point, she flipped on me too. So welcome to global planetary Titanic Deckchairs. We didn't have to be here. Here in Oz, 12.1% of the population voted Green as their first preference vote at the last election. But the Liberal Party and the Labor Party preferenced each other. And the One Nation Party preferenced the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party preferenced the One Nation Party. The Liberal Party lost. The Green Party had a 15% swing towards it, but they lost 3 of their 4 seats in the House of Representatives. They've got a few senators left, but it appears like the Greens are diminished. I don't know how long that's going to stick around for. I think a lot of people are coming to the realisation that the planet's kicking back pretty hard just now. Somewhere on the western edge of South Australia, an algae bloom started. And the first notice anybody got of it was the dead, well, first there was foam washing up on the beach. Algae produces surfactant, which turns wave action into foam. And that same surfactant is what clogs the gills of sea creatures. So then there was all of the dead things washing up on the beach. And that's gone across the entire South Australian coast. It's gone up the Coorong. It's into the freshwater estuaries and everything. Commercial fishermen are going out there with a great big diesel-powered boat and all the lines and nets and high-techery in the world, and they're coming back with, oh, well, I've got 15 whiting for the day. You know, they've got enough to feed their family, but not enough to pay for the cost of the boat and all the shit they've got to go through to get them fish. The people who run tourism businesses selling dive tours, and nobody even wants to sit on the beach. It's covered in dead sea life going rotten. And the best marine biologists have told the government that they don't know what's going on, but seeing as the last rain of storms and winds haven't done anything to moderate the algae bloom, probably better get used to the idea it's going to be around for at least a year, and no idea when that's going to stop. I hear turkeys burning pretty well at the moment. In the excited status a couple of weeks, 7 days ago, a 20-year-old stepson who'd been living out of his car for maybe a year in Idaho spontaneously lit a fire in the hills and then started shooting firefighters. My son is a firefighter. I'm a firefighter, but in a much smaller way. You know, I'm a basic firefighter. He's a group officer. He commands 28 brigades sometimes. He only got 6 or 8 that he actually looks after administratively. But there are times when the people from the city who didn't grow up in a bushfire fuel bomb and don't know quite how to handle them, when they run out of ideas, cough, cough, young fella, will you go and handle the phones, and tomorrow you're acting divisional commander, go and put all these problems out. His theory was that, well, in the US, firefighting's not done by volunteers with state finance for the equipment and an administrative core of people who've got all of the qualifications, and the volunteers show up because they want to help the community by being a fireman. That's not how it's done in America. In America, you have to go and pay money to do training courses that we all get for free. All we have to do is turn up. If it's away, sometimes we get assistance with the accommodation and travel if we're high enough up in the brigade sort of thing. I don't know, I've never had to do one of it. But in the US, no, you have to go and pay money to be trained, to get a qualification. The qualifications have all got time limits on them. And firefighting companies competitively bid and submit tenders for the contract to look after particular parts of the country, and you get interfaces and overlaps and internecine border disputes worse than, you know, when the New South Wales Volunteer Fire Brigade, who are municipal based and they are retained firefighters, which means they get paid a set amount of money, which means they have to go to training and they have to show out to 85% of call-outs. Sometimes they get cranky with the rural fire service, who are volunteers, and we turn up because, you know, we just like putting fire out and we want to be a good bloke on the day, you know, feel good about ourselves. It's better than joining the army and getting your head shot off kind of thing. Sometimes there are jurisdictional disputes, like a crashed car in the middle of a paddock, you know, and 2 brigades show up. Yeah, sometimes the actual volunteers, which is us, get a bit shirty because the retainer paid volunteers from the town have showed up first, and they want to tell us what to do and put us on traffic control while they get paid for it. Meanwhile, we've put our day on hold, but that's a long segue getting away from the point. The point is, my son had the theory that perhaps whoever shot at the firefighters had their nose out of joint because they had tendered for a contract, or they had been trying to get employed by a particular fire crew and they'd been repeatedly told to go away, piss off, we don't want to know about you. And it was a very long chain of entities And just on the Occam's razor thing, like the simple answer is probably going to be the easiest. Rather than invoke this hypothetical list of grievances by somebody who had the shits with the fire brigade, or someone who had the shits with the people who hired the fire brigade, and no. It was a stepson, an only child stepson, who at age 20 was living in his car for a year because he couldn't handle it with mummy's new boyfriend-shaped object. And his family, the family of the shooter, their only media statement has come from stepdaddy's lawyer. Oh, we have no idea what made him want to do that. I think the USA is a fulminating powder keg of popcorn kernels, and the temperature's raising on the kettle, and they're all just about to go fizz bang pop. I was born to a stepmother. I have 3 half siblings. Repartnering is only good for annoying children. If I had my way, it wouldn't be lawful. Particularly because I married a woman with 2 kids at foot, and I turned into the stepfather from hell. And I know that my selfish decision to try and play happy families with their mother was what turned their childhood into shit. So whatever goes wrong with their lives, I'm partly responsible for it. Because for 7 years I was, taking their mother's attention away from them. So this is a 20-year-old kid whose mother's so busy forking for the new boyfriend that she can't be bothered paying attention to the teenage kid until he leaves the house and goes and lives in his bloody car. There's 340 million people in the USA. And they've been glorifying the Brady Bunch at least since the 1970s, probably back to the 1950s with a Hollywood movie called Cheaper by the Dozen. I think the level of social collapse that's going to go on everywhere as this extremely accelerated intense weather multiplies as a result of the overturning of the smog. I mean, that's just going to ramp it all up. Infrastructure is going to continually be getting smashed. And nowhere is there a nation with an economy which has maintained their civil engineering, their roads, their power lines, on a sound engineering principle of doing continual maintenance, preventative maintenance. Everywhere used to be like that, but since the 1970s it's all deteriorated, and now it's a replace or emergency repair when necessary basis for your bridges and your power line pylons. It's 2025 and they were put there in the 1970s and they had a 40-year design life expectancy, and they were designed to only have to cope with 80 kilometre an hour winds, and now they've got to cope with 120 kilometre an hour winds, and they're 50 or 60 years old. A lot of stuff is ready to fail and it needs to be replaced yesterday, and nowhere has the resources to fix it. The hilarious part about the USA is that over there, they've just got rid of all of their emergency services. Like, they've defunded the Federal Emergency Services Management Agency, Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. And for 20 years, there's been right-wing paranoid lunatics saying that the Democrats wanted to use the FEMA camps as concentration camps for their political opponents. I saw a cartoon the other day where there was a bloke dressed up in the US National Guard uniform outside 2 FEMA camps, and he was saying to the reporter, oh no, they're not for illegal aliens. That one's for dissidents and reporters, and that one's for Democrats. I find you can learn a lot about the mood of a civilization or a population by paying attention to their comedians and their cartoons. That reflects the zeitgeist of the society. When you look at how many angry, hopeless youngsters there are and add them on to all of the people whose lives are getting turned upside down, well, the inflation set off by Trump's tariff war means that they're not going to be able to afford to buy anything. No, nobody on the planet wants to buy anything that they make. They're going to have no hospital to go to because all of the state hospitals were being subsidised by Medicaid. And all of the people who voted for Trump to go in there and get rid of the waste and the fraud and the corruption didn't realise that all of their own hospitals locally, that's what they've just voted to get rid of. And apparently, as late as 24 hours before the signing of the great big abominable bill, Trump was unaware that they were cutting Medicare and Medicaid and SNP, the Supplemental Nutrition Program. He's a figurehead with a cranium of solid wood. He hasn't got a clue what it is that his changes are going to do. He's just been told, you know, this will put you in charge and you can make a lot of money. And as I said in the previous video, one hypothesis which would explain a lot to me would be if the reason Trump is such an unlovable, unloved individual is because he never was loved. I think that as a result of obstetric difficulties, his mother was told not to have any more children, and I think Fred Trump took as much notice of a doctor as Donald Trump does of anything, because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and Donald Trump's been convicted of digital rape. He probably, if he didn't learn it from his father, he picked it up from his vibes. I think the reason Donald Trump's mother didn't want to have anything to do with him is because Donald Trump reminded her of Fred Trump. So you've just got this little ball of bitterness and lack of love, and that's what's driving him. And he wants to fill that emptiness with his ability to consume wealth and riches and turn it to shit. So he's consuming the wealth of America and he's turning it into shit. But yeah, that southern meridional overturning circulation current, that was one of the 16 tipping points that were poised and ready to go, and it went in 2014. It went in 2014. And we got the first kick up the arse from it in 2018. And from here on in, all I can really suggest is that each one of us tries to be as selfless as possible. Try and burn as little atmospheric, or try and burn as little fossil carbon and emit as little atmospheric fossil carbon as possible, because it takes 25 years for a cubic metre of carbon dioxide to accomplish 95% of the warming that it's going to do. So this year's aberrant weather is a result of all of the carbon that humanity had released before the year 2000. And the rate at which the weather is going to get worse, I used to think it was going to be in parallel, whoopsie, for graph purposes, in parallel to the growth in fossil carbon emissions. You know, you emit the fossil carbon and 20 years later you get the storm. So but it's not a smooth change. It's not a curve, because we've just had a step change in the emission rate of carbon dioxide because the Southern Ocean has decided to fart in our general direction. Antarctica farts in our direction. Probably a good title for the video, which will no doubt long enough at this point. Tipping point, oh tipping point. Tipping point, gonna flip on you. Tipping point, oh tipping point. Big one tipped and we're all in the poo. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao. Bonus extra features. Here. Is the one-piece aluminium microphone holder, which can sit on the shirt or on the camera.